Now you get the opportunity to hear Dr. Mark Laser, world expert, in my estimation, Christian expert on sexual addiction. When I first was introduced to him, I read his book. I read every page. I rarely read every page. It was so alive, electric, and so informative. I mean, I learned everything I needed to learn about what causes sexual addiction, how you get over it. I was thrilled. He's one of the few authors that I picked up the phone immediately, called his home, told him how much I loved it. I mean, I am amazed. And now we get the privilege of partnering with him on this DVD where you get to learn the very things that I began to read about.
Now Dr. Laser is going to teach us through some rich content how to identify where we're at. Are we struggling or are we addicted? We hope that through the next few sessions that you're going to be able to really answer some deep questions about where you're at in life, where your heart is, as we've talked about, in searching our hearts to determine where you are, not only in your personal life, but how this is affecting your marriage, how this is affecting your work, how this is affecting every area of your life. So we ask right now that you open your heart, open your mind to the teachings of Dr. Mark Laser.
The first characteristic that we talk about with sexual addiction is this kind of powerful word. We say it is unmanageable. You'll know, some of you who know the 12-step tradition, the first step of Alcoholics Anonymous is, I admitted that I was powerless over alcohol and that my life had become unmanageable. So an addict is a person who has not been able in their life to truly surrender their life to the control of God. And until that happens, until a person really is in a committed relationship with Christ, working on that every day for the rest of their life, these sexual temptations and things are going to come along and basically hijack the mind of an addict, and it's going to feel to them that they are totally out of control. It's basically like what Paul throughout the New Testament talks about as being kind of double-minded. In Romans 7:15, he says, the good that I would, I don't do. The evil that I hate, that is what I do. That is the constant struggle that we're all in every day, to do the right thing and avoid the wrong thing. And I think every addict that I've ever known, every sexual addict that I've ever treated or dealt with, they have basically two parts of themselves. There's a part that wants to follow God, be spiritual, know Christ, get into a more dependent relationship with Christ. There's that part. But there's that other part of them that has been using addiction for years and years and years in their life to cope, to survive, to get their needs met. And many, many days in their active addiction, they're struggling to be the man God calls them to be, or to kind of give in to their addictive behaviors because that's how they've survived. And many days, it's a balancing act. James, the brother of Christ, talks about in his letter in the first chapter, we are those double-minded people. We're going back and forth. That's basically, I think, a picture of unmanageability. We feel out of control. We feel hijacked. We feel like it's an impulse. We feel like we're on automatic pilot. I mean, I've known so many addicts who they basically, in their mind, kind of dissociate. They feel like they're just going to do this come whatever may happen. And at that point, they feel like their body, their mind, their lust, their craziness has just taken over. Now, I could tell you stories and stories and stories of addicts that have lost their lives due to sexually transmitted disease, lost their marriages, lost their jobs. Right now, one of the great sadnesses in our practice is every time we see a person who's been fired from their job for internet addiction. This is seemingly on the surface an unmanageable problem. But again, remember the double-minded nature of all addicts. And remember the fact that this is original sin. And remember the fact that until an addict learns how to, on a daily basis, truly surrender their life to Christ, there's not going to be healing and recovery. The second point is that addiction, for it to be an addiction, must create what we call neurochemical tolerance. Now basically that's a phenomenon in the brain, as many of you I'm sure already know, where the brain is going to adjust to whatever you put into the brain, and when it makes that adjustment, it's going to need more of that chemical to achieve the same effect. Now, for alcoholics, when you drink alcohol in any of its varieties, you take that into yourself, it gets converted into things that bathe your brain with various kinds of neurochemistries, and your brain adjusts. So if in the beginning days of your drinking one beer makes you drunk, after a few weeks or months of this, one beer isn't going to make you drunk anymore. You're going to need another beer. And of course, all of us know people who have gotten so ramped up in this that they're drinking cases of beer, fifths of whiskey, incredible amounts of alcohol just to achieve the same effect that they would have had years before by having a small amount of that substance. Because for it to be an addiction, according to the medical world, it has to be able to create tolerance. When you fantasize about sex, when you engage in sex, even if it's only masturbation, and you have a orgasmic release, there are chemicals at both ends of that spectrum that are being released in your brain. The pursuit of sex and fantasy or engaging or trying to obtain it in whatever way, that creates powerful chemicals like dopamine, for example, that takes our mood up and we get excited. Sometimes when we're pursuing sex, it's new, it's exciting, adrenaline gets produced, adrenaline elevates dopamine. I mean, there are powerful things going on in the brain just when we think about and pursue sex. Now, at the end of that response, when we actually have an orgasm, all of you watching probably know about the incredible relaxation effect of that. Well, there are many neurochemicals released in the brain called catecholamines. These chemicals have an ability to relax us. They are morphine and heroin-like in their effect, and they give us an intense sense of pleasure. Well, as you recognize those responses in your own brain, just think about the fact that if you're masturbating once, twice, or more a day, if you're engaging in sex on a very frequent basis, if you're fantasizing about all kinds of things, this is going to be releasing lots of neurochemicals in your brain. Your brain is going to adjust, and it's going to need more of those neurochemicals to achieve the same effect. There is no doubt in my mind that sexual addiction is a form of drug addiction. The drugs are produced in our own human brain. Now that makes recovery from sexual addiction especially challenging, don't you think? Because we don't need to go out to a liquor store or a bar or buy it on the street to get our supply. All we need to do is maybe turn on our television set or click into the internet or click into our memories, because there's lots of stuff that has been stored there. So we're going to have to really do what Paul talks to us about in Romans 12:2, and that is we're going to need to be transformational in terms of the mind. Number 3, because of this factor of tolerance, we're going to need more of the same to achieve the same effect. That's what leads us to say that for something to be an addiction, it has to create a progression. It has to get worse over time. My story, it started out stealing a magazine once a month, started masturbating later once a month. Over the years, the frequency of looking at pornography, the frequency of masturbation, the frequency of any other activities may increase. Now, one of the things to think about there and be aware of is that in my story, you can go basically between age 11 and age 37 and see a 25-year progression of how it got worse over time. Now, in that, there were periods where I gave certain of those activities up for months, maybe even a year or two in some cases, but I would always return to it eventually. And that is the case with almost every addict I've known. They've been able to give it up for a while just to return to it, or they've been able to give up certain parts of it for a while they were maintaining other things, and they will eventually always come back. We are in the middle of a crisis in our culture, And that crisis is being created by the internet, and the internet is bombarding us with so many different sexually pornographic websites that basically what has been happening over the last 5 to 10 years is that the time at which it takes an addict to ramp into an addiction has dramatically shortened. The internet has the ability to suck people in like nothing I've ever seen before. Back when I was 11, you had to wait 30 days to get your next source of supply. Today, in an hour's time, you can visit over 100 websites that have all kinds of incredible things on them, and you can basically see that as our culture has ramped itself up, so has the speed at which many of us can get tolerant and get more addicted all the time. For now, the point is, when you take a history, you're going to be able to go from not doing any of this to gradual, sometimes maybe more rapid escalation. There'll always be a pattern of increasing activity of some kind. Now be careful, it doesn't necessarily always mean, doesn't usually mean that you're going to graduate from one kind of sexual activity to more difficult sexual activities. It may simply mean that you do that kind of activity more often. I mean, the classic case would be pornography and masturbation. If you do that once a month, over time you're going to wind up doing it once a day or more. And I'm not going to get into a lot of cases now, but I've certainly seen individuals who have engaged in pornography for hours and hours and hours every day, masturbated multiple times every day, and that's how serious this can get, even if it only remains a pornography and masturbation problem at that point. Number 4, as we're talking about these crazy, awful things, you can imagine that there are destructive and negative consequences. There are all kind of physical consequences, medical consequences. You know, the possibility of STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, is incredible and amazing. There are lots of people who have lost sexual functioning due to that. There are people who have lost their lives due to that. There are people who present themselves to the doctor who are sexually sinning. They're not talking about that. They're talking about the stomach aches, the headaches, the back aches, the variety of other physical symptoms that they had. I mean, basically, to do these behaviors and try to cover them up is an incredibly stressful thing, and it's going to lead to potentially all kinds of medical problems in your body. The legal consequences, right now I'm treating about 5 or 6 men who've gotten out of jail for having done various kinds of sexually offending behaviors. They now, for the rest of their lives, are going to be marked in our culture as a sexual offender. 3 of them now simply just cannot find a job to support their families, and it's an incredibly sad thing. That's the legal consequence of a sexual offense, but there are obviously other kinds of legal consequences. Arrest for soliciting prostitution, indecent public exposure, people who are having to get themselves embarrassed in the paper because of these kinds of behaviors. There are people who are getting sued. I know that was the case in my story. Later on, after I got in recovery, there were several lawsuits that were part of my consequences and my recovery journey. Well, you know, there are those kind of devastating legal things that can happen. There are social consequences. You lose friendships. People don't want to talk to you anymore. You lose relationships at the highest, most intimate level. You may even have the family part of that, and there's a certain percentage of sex addicts who will wind up divorced if both husband and wife don't get treated. The kids and the devastating effect of divorce on children is profound. The next point is that because of the neurochemical effect of sexual addiction, you know, with the high, the dopamine, the adrenaline, the various kinds of things that happen in the brain, we can use sexual fantasy and activity to alter or change the way we feel. And the way we put that point is sexual addiction can be used to escape your feelings. So if you're depressed or stressed or sad or lonely or angry, you know, doing these sexual things may be a way that you try to cope and survive what you're experiencing. So one of the ways to look at sexual addiction for some is that it's a stress management strategy. For some, it's an anger management strategy. For many, including myself, it's an anxiety management strategy. You worry about things, you're coping with something, you have all kinds of anxiety, you think about something pleasurable, engage in the various forms of sexuality. That takes your mood to a different place. You have the high of being orgasmic. That brings all that intense heroin-like stuff. You can see where, as we're beginning to understand the neurochemistry, whatever you're feeling, you can change it through your own self-manipulation. One of the things we say about sex addicts is that they seek to be pharmacologists of their own brain. Well, that's any addiction, really. Whether it's alcohol, cocaine, eating, even working, basically when we engage in that activity, we're seeking to change the way we feel. The next point is difficult because I don't like it. It makes me feel some sense of shame today, but it's called entitlement. In many of the years of my active sexual addiction, I was not only a Christian, I was an ordained minister, and I was a PhD level therapist. So, ministers, Christians, therapists, how do you justify all this crazy behavior? Well, one of the factors that I used is the factor of entitlement. It's basically a long, age-old anger that many addicts have in them. No one loves them, no one likes them, no one takes care of their needs. They're taking care of everybody else, and they deserve to get some of their needs met. As a pastor, I'm thinking, I'm serving everybody else. The week that I was intervened on, I had 43 counseling hours scheduled. I was serving on the school board. I was preaching at a church on Sunday. We had 3 kids. I was teaching at the local Christian college. Basically I was also into a workaholism, and I was escaping lots of things by being incredibly busy. But it did allow me to say, gee, I'm doing all these things for other people. Maybe God will not mind that much that I'm masturbating or looking at pornography or whatever else I was doing. There's this sense of entitlement. I deserve for this to happen. There are a whole lot of people who say they're Christians, act and behave like Christians in many ways, but are angry at God, haven't truly surrendered their life to Christ. And by that, I'm not trying to be judgmental. I'm just saying they've had a hard time really letting go, really submitting, because there's a part of their spirit that said, if God was a loving God, He wouldn't let me do these things or wouldn't have let these things happen to me. He'd be taking care of my needs. He wouldn't have put me in this marriage that I'm in. That's another one, obviously, in this entitlement thing. My wife, if she were truly a godly woman, submitting like it talks about in Ephesians 5 or whatever it is, I wouldn't be struggling with this kind of issue. The next one is it's used as a reward. Well, if you're entitled, if you deserve something, if you've rationalized it, denied it somehow, gotten past your religious defenses, you're using this as a reward. I'm doing something nice to myself by engaging in this activity. I'm the only one doing it. No one else cares about me. No one else loves me. I'm a bad and worthless person, so I'm going to do this, and this is my reward. The final point in this list of the definition of sexual addiction is that for an addict to engage in these sexual behaviors, it gives them a feeling of being powerful. Now think about that. If you engage in sex in a normal, intimate relationship with your spouse, that requires you to have a relationship. You might be out of control in that. You might not have as much power as you'd like to have. With the internet or with a magazine or with a video or with whatever it is, you're the one that controls whether or not you look at it, or so you think. You're the one that opens the pages, plops in the video, turns on the computer or the internet. You think you have power.
I remember missing class, missing graduate school that I was paying for, to go home and look at my pornography.
As my addiction escalated, then I just started to I started having sexual encounters of a variety of kinds with lots of different women.
I was hiding it. I found out ways to hide it on the computer, to delete things where she wouldn't see it. It was slowly just pushing us further and further apart.
There's this avalanche of need once you get started with it.
I felt like I was really taken advantage of. At that point, I saw no hope.
That was probably the most intense time in which pornography really began to take the form of an addiction for me. It was an incredibly intense time in terms of fighting that battle with pornography.